I appreciate you following me along as I jump through so many different elements of this particular episode here. But this is another element, right, that I touched on earlier about the whole model minority myth. And of course, I underscore this idea of the myth. And how do these myths become reality, right? And here is a very popular cover of Time magazine that actually was brought to my attention when I was in high school by my high school counselor, right? It was the beginning of the school year, I believe, right? Sometimes our memories are really shaky, but this is what I remember. She's holding this up as I'm hurriedly coming into school for the school year, and she's screaming at me, screaming my name. And I'm like, who is this person screaming my name? I'm just trying to find my friends, what their schedules are for the semester. And she's pointing to this with all these other students, right, running and screaming. She's like, Yoon, look at this. This is you. And I'm like, now, how am I supposed to think about this? I have no concept of any of this stuff, right? But here she is pointing me out saying, oh, well, look, you're one of those Asian American whiz kids, and it must be true because it's on Time magazine, right? So I don't know, maybe for some of you also looking at this, this is reflective of some aspect of your experience. But also, what does this mean when that particular kind of identity is foisted upon you? Do you internalize that? Right? Do you fight against it? How do you work with it? How do you work against it? I'll tell you that throughout high school, it's certainly something that I thought, well, is this something I'm supposed to be because I'm Asian, right? I had no concept of, right, race relations in the United States, but somehow, somewhere, all these messages told me that I had to be smart, that I had to be good in math in particular, right? And I won't tell you, right, how often I cheated in math, right, to get to what I thought was a place that I should be. But it's really the power of the myth to really decide the kinds of realities that we would live. Now, the next two visuals will really kind of showcase the modern mid-20th century kind of rise of the model minority myth that I particularly wish we would stop talking about, but I realize it's a reality that I'm still teaching about in the 20 years that I've been teaching. So it's really starts from the midst of the civil rights movement in the United States, right? So the beginning of this caption of the New York Times Magazine, the Sunday magazine, success story, Japanese American style. And it's written by a very famous sociologist out of UC Berkeley, I believe, and who talks about, if we think about today's minority groups and we think about how they've been oppressed, right? This is the way that the narrative begins. We should really take into account the plight of Japanese Americans. With what occurred during World War II, we need to recognize how their hard work, right? They didn't need governmental programs to kind of have the success level that they did. So it goes in a way that doesn't talk about African American protests directly, but it is definitely saying, because of the time period in which this is happening, 1964, civil rights acts are being passed, as well as the Voting Rights Acts of 1965. So there are so many different kinds of contextual elements going on in our society that brings to bear, well, look at this group that didn't complain about anything, but yet who, if we think about it in the context of the United States history, they really have the right to complain about things. And shortly thereafter, right, this is U.S. News and World Report. It touts another successful minority group, Chinese Americans, Chinese immigrants now, right? And again, it's following along the same line of the previous article, but this one makes it even more explicit, right? With the opening passage that talks about, the plight of what's happening, the political climate that's going on in the United States right now with African Americans, right, kind of clamoring with vocal protests. Here is a group too that's not complaining, but they made it through the dint of their own hard work. And here we have kind of that re-representation of that Horatio Alger story of pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps to make it and be successful, and also kind of typify that myth of that immigrant success story. So these images that we think are so, well, Why should we question, right? Well, Asians are successful. They are smart. Why should it be seen as such a bad thing? Well, the thing that we need to remember is, how do these images and perceptions and misperceptions, how do they develop over time? What were the kinds of misguided ways in which we've all been led to believe that, right? Because believe you me, it's still something that I argue with my own family members about, right? My own communities back home. Why we need to trouble these notions of what constitutes success. Because think about it, and especially in the context of schools and in education. When we talk about one group being successful, especially Asians, what group do we think about as being unsuccessful, especially academically? Because what happens to one group does have an effect in the ways that we perceive about other groups, and that is wholly inaccurate. Okay, we need to think about how these images always work in tangents, so that there's these ways that we implicitly or explicitly think about a successful group and other groups that just don't quite get it, right? And that it's their fault. It's kind of their problem that they haven't worked it through. But again, remember, I want to remind you of that 100-year gap that we've had in our American history of developing public school systems for white school children and African American school children, right? To think about that. And so it's also in the context of these things that there's so many more, but some of the kind of main three things to kind of demystify in these kinds of success myths, right? That academic success of Asian Pacific Americans it's somehow from innate intelligence, and that we have no academic challenges. Well, of course, the more research that you do, and again, I want to remind you of the diversity within Asian American, Asian Pacific American communities, is that that's not always the case, right? And that the immigration patterns also have such a high way of thinking about educational attainment, especially if we think about East Asian immigrants and South Asian immigrants, and that the post-1965 Immigration Act, which favored professionals and educated adults, right? Because that we also have to think about who gets admitted to the United States and on what basis. You got to have skills, right? You got to have something to bring to the country. So it was those who were more professional, who are more highly educated, who are able to come to the United States, and right, future subsequent generations had kids, right, who then you really impart those kinds of educational aspirations to your own offspring, right? But to also think about those patterns, which are also complicated in so many ways, but it also does not take into account the growth of the 70s, the 80s, the refugee acts that also kind of trouble different elements of what these success myths mean. And it also plays a part in trying to explain these, like the Pew reports, for example, that talks about the higher education levels and median incomes of Asian Pacific American families, right? So I just laid out this one small example of immigration patterns having an aspect of higher education attainment levels, as well as the higher median income levels come from the fact that typically for Asian Pacific American families, there are two or more working people that contribute to the household income. So it's really different than what we think about the nuclear family with the one primary breadwinner versus two plus, right, who contribute to the family income. And also, again, to really reiterate the point of the myth is that it's not to say they're not hardworking, but it's this myth that they don't need any kinds of government subsidies or help, and that anyone can be successful without government assistance.